Your job was to bathe the millionaire. Falling in love wasn't part of the contract. The sound of Riley Anderson's suitcase wheels echoed through the immaculate corridors of the Bennett mansion located in the exclusive Beverly Hills district. Each step towards her new job was accompanied by a mixture of anxiety and determination. At 28, Riley had already cared for several patients, but never someone like Lucas Bennett, the young tech mogul who 3 weeks ago had made headlines after his private helicopter crashed during a storm in the Santa Monica Mountains. The housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, a stern-looking lady with impeccable posture, guided Riley through the mansion of contemporary architecture. "Mr. Bennett is different since the accident," explained the housekeeper, hesitating slightly. "He used to be known for his charismatic personality at business meetings, but now—" Her voice dropped, leaving the incomplete sentence hanging in the air. Riley adjusted the strap of her professional bag, where she carried her nursing equipment. Her impressive CV and exemplary references had secured her a job, but she knew that her biggest challenge wouldn't be technical, it would be human. As they entered the main room on the second floor, Riley immediately noticed the figure sitting next to the panoramic window. Lucas Bennett, 32, was watching the immaculate garden with a distant gaze. Even in his wheelchair, his presence was commanding. His tense jaw and rigid shoulders conveyed a clear message: he didn't want anyone there. "Mr. Bennett, this is Riley Anderson, your new private nurse," announced Mrs. Henderson. Lucas turned his chair slowly, his blue-gray eyes studying Riley with a calculated coldness. "One more," he commented, his tone laden with disdain. "How long do you intend to hold out before you give up? The last one only lasted 3 days. Riley maintained her professional posture, holding his gaze without hesitation. "I intend to stay as long as it takes for your full recovery, Mr. Bennett." A humorless smile curved his lips. "We'll see." Mrs. Henderson discreetly withdrew, leaving Riley alone with her new patient. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. "Your tests indicate that the paralysis is temporary." Riley began consulting the medical folders she had meticulously studied. "With proper physiotherapy and dedication, you'll be able to..." "Spare me the motivational speech," Lucas interrupted. "I've already heard that from the other 5 specialists who've been here." Riley closed the folder quietly. "All right, how about we start with something more basic? I need to check your vital signs and do the first physical exam of the day." Approaching him, Riley noticed the tension rise in his shoulders as she touched his wrist. Her fingers were gentle but firm, professional. For a moment, he noticed a slight scar on his forearm, probably from the accident. "Your heart rate is a little elevated," she observed. "Having strangers invade my personal space tends to have that effect," he retorted. Riley continued his work methodically, ignoring the provocations. While he carried out the basic procedures, he observed the details of the room: photos of Lucas in different countries, prestigious diplomas on the walls, a bookcase full of books on technology and innovation. It was the portrait of a dynamic and successful life now forced to an abrupt halt. "Did you used to play sports?" asked Riley, noticing a photo of him surfing. "Does it matter? Every piece of information about your previous active life could be useful in developing a more effective recovery plan." Lucas stared at her for a moment, as if assessing her sincerity. "Surfing, swimming, running." Satisfied, Riley made some notes on her clipboard. "For now, let's start with light exercise today, focusing mainly on..." "I'm not interested in exercise today," he cut in, turning his chair back towards the window. Riley took a deep breath, keeping calm. "Mr. Bennett, I know you're frustrated, but your recovery depends..." "You don't know anything about me," he snapped, his voice laced with bitterness. "Don't pretend you understand what it's like to have everything and then in a second lose control of your own body." "You're right," Riley replied softly. "I don't know what it's like, but I do know what it's like to fight to regain something that seems lost. And I know that giving up isn't the answer." Something in her tone must have penetrated Lucas' armor, because he turned his head slightly in her direction, his eyes meeting hers with less hostility this time. "Tomorrow," he finally said. "We'll start the exercises tomorrow." Riley nodded, recognizing the small victory. As she organized her equipment, she could feel his gaze on her, probably trying to decipher her true intentions. He was a man used to people approaching him out of interest, and his distrust was understandable. The rest of the day was dedicated to establishing a routine, getting to know the structure of the house, and reviewing the medical protocols with the team. Riley knew there was a long road ahead, not only for Lucas' physical recovery, but also for breaking down the emotional barriers he had erected. As the sun began to set, painting the Los Angeles sky in shades of orange and pink, Riley prepared to call it a day. Before leaving, he returned to his room for one last check. Lucas was asleep, his face finally free of the mask of bitterness he wore when awake. Riley discreetly adjusted his pillow and checked his heart monitor. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to observe the man behind the patient, someone who, for all his wealth and success, was now facing his greatest challenge. "Good night, Mr. Bennett," she whispered, heading for the door. "See you tomorrow, Miss Anderson," his sleepy voice replied, surprising her. Riley smiled slightly as he left. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning. The second day at the Bennett mansion began before sunrise. Riley arrived early, determined to establish a routine that would benefit Lucas's recovery. She found Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "He didn't sleep well last night," the housekeeper reported quietly. "He got restless, refused the tranquilizers. The nightmares of the accident are still troubling him." Riley nodded, making mental notes. The psychological trauma was as important to treat as the physical limitations. While she was organizing the equipment for the first exercise session, she heard Lucas' voice coming from the bedroom. "I've canceled my video conference with the council, Marcus," he said into the phone, his voice tense. "I'm not going to show up for those meetings while I'm like this. Keep everything running and keep me informed." When Riley entered the room, Lucas abruptly hung up the phone. He was dressed in designer sportswear, but his face showed fatigue. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett. Ready to start?" "I didn't have much choice, did I?" he replied, but his tone was less hostile than the day before. Riley began with basic mobility exercises focusing on the legs. His experienced hands guided the movements with professional precision as he explained each exercise. To his surprise, Lucas was attentive to the instructions. Sensitivity is starting to return in some areas, she noted, testing his reflexes. "That's an excellent sign." "It's still not enough," Lucas muttered, frustration evident in his voice. "I have a company to run projects and development. I can't sit around waiting for my body to decide to work again." "Rome wasn't built in a day, Mr. Bennett," Riley replied, adjusting the position of his leg. "And neither will your recovery. You always have an answer ready, don't you?" There was a slight tone of amusement in her voice. "It's part of the job," she smiled, continuing her exercises. "Now tell me about this company you so desperately need to get back to running." Lucas hesitated for a moment, but then started talking about Bennett Tech, his assistive technology development company. Riley noticed that his face lit up when he talked about the projects that help people with disabilities. "Ironic, isn't it?" he laughed humorlessly. "I've spent years developing technology to help people with physical limitations, and now you have a unique perspective on the real impact of your work," Riley added softly. Lucas's gaze met hers, surprised by the observation. For a moment, his mask of indifference fell away. The session continued with strengthening exercises, and Riley noticed that Lucas was pushing himself harder than he had expected. When a bead of sweat trickled down her temple, she realized it was time for a break. 5 minutes, she announced, reaching for a bottle of water. "I could do more," he insisted. "Power and duty are different things, Mr. Bennett. Overexertion can jeopardize your recovery." As they rested, Riley noticed the tablet on the next table showing news about Bennett Tech. The company's shares had fallen after the accident, and speculation about the company's future was constant. "It must be hard to watch from afar," she commented. Lucas studied her for a moment. "Why did you choose to be a nurse?" The question took her by surprise. It was the first time he had shown an interest in knowing something about her. "My younger sister had a congenital heart condition," Riley answered honestly. "I spent a lot of time in hospitals with her. I learned that sometimes care goes beyond medicine. It's about being present, understanding the patient as a person. In your sister, she's fine now, married with 2 children. But that experience changed my life." Lucas absorbed the information in silence, his gaze less defensive. The rest of the morning was spent doing more exercises and planning the recovery routine. Riley noticed that little by little Lucas began to open up, asking questions about the process and sharing more about his life before the accident. Over lunch served on the terrace overlooking the gardens, Lucas surprised Riley by asking about his other patients. The most challenging was an 85-year-old man who refused to exercise until I learned to play chess with him, she said, drawing a genuine smile from Lucas. And you learned, of course. I lost every game, but he did his physio. The sound of Lucas's laughter echoed across the terrace, taking them both by surprise. It was probably the first time he had laughed since the accident. In the afternoon during the breathing exercises, Riley noticed that the constant tension in Lucas' shoulders had eased slightly. Small progress, but significant. Tomorrow will increase the intensity, she informed him as she organized his equipment at the end of the day. You really don't give up easily, do you? Lucas commented, watching her. No, and I think it's worth it, she replied simply. Before leaving, Riley updated her chart with the day's observations. In addition to the physical progress, she noticed subtle changes in Lucas' behavior, less resistance, more engagement, moments of vulnerability. Miss Anderson, Lucas called out as she stood in the doorway. Thank you for today. Riley smiled. See you tomorrow, Mr. Bennett. As he drove back to his small apartment in Silver Lake, Riley reflected on the day's events. The ice barrier Lucas had built was beginning to melt, revealing glimpses of the man behind the bitter facade. It was delicate progress, and she knew she would need to maintain the balance between professional closeness and appropriate distance. What she didn't expect was that evening her thoughts would keep returning to the genuine smile she had witnessed on the terrace and to the moments when his eyes had lost that characteristic hardness. Riley told herself it was just professional satisfaction at her patient's progress, but a small part of her knew there was something else beginning to develop, something she would need to keep strictly under control. A week had passed since Riley began her work at the Bennett mansion, and the subtle changes in Lucas were increasingly evident. That Wednesday morning, she found him already awake and dressed for exercise, a significant change from the man who had initially resisted any kind of activity. I've managed to sleep for 6 hours straight, he commented when she came in, a tone of victory in his voice. No note, miss? Riley smiled as he organized the equipment. The exercises are helping with sleep. Your body is starting to find its natural rhythm again. During the morning session, Riley noticed significant progress in the muscular strength of Lucas's legs. While performing the mobility exercises, his hands noticed small muscle spasms, promising signs of recovery. I felt it, Lucas said suddenly, his eyes wide. When you pressed on my calf, I felt it. The expression of surprise and hope on his face made something shudder inside Riley. It was the first time she had seen him truly vulnerable without his usual barriers. That's excellent, Mr. Bennett, she replied professionally, ignoring the warmth she felt at seeing his genuine smile. Let's try some sensitivity exercises. As they worked, Lucas began to talk about his childhood, something he had never done before. My parents died in a car accident when I was 16, he revealed. Maybe that's why I was so dedicated to vehicle safety technology at Bennett Tech. Riley kept his hands busy with the exercises, giving him space to continue. That must have been hard to deal with at such a young age. It was, but it made me who I am. I built a company from scratch, determined to make a difference. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. The helicopter crash brought it all back. It's understandable to be afraid, Riley said softly. But you survived for a reason. Lucas studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher something in her expression. Do you always see the positive side of things? Not always. But I've learned that it's a choice we make every day. Over lunch in the Winter Garden, Lucas surprised Riley by asking about her life outside of work. You must have a boyfriend who's worried about your long hours here, he commented, trying to sound casual. Riley felt her cheeks heat up slightly. No, actually, my job doesn't leave much time for relationships. Something flashed across Lucas's face, relief, but it was so fast that she couldn't be sure. In the afternoon, during a hydrotherapy session in the mansion's heated pool, an unexpected moment changed the dynamic between them. Lucas briefly lost his balance, and Riley instinctively held in their bodies close in the warm water. For a second that seemed eternal, their gazes met, and Riley felt his breathing falter. I think we can call it a night, she said, moving away quickly and helping him out of the pool. Later, while updating the medical records in her makeshift office, Riley was surprised by Mrs. Henderson. He's different with you, the housekeeper observed. More alive. It's just the natural progression of therapy, Riley replied, trying to maintain her professionalism. Darling, I've been working for the Bennetts for 15 years. I've never seen Lucas open up like this to anyone. The housekeeper's words echoed in Riley's mind throughout the night. In her apartment while going over the day's notes, she found herself recalling the moment by the pool, the warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze. The next day, Riley arrived earlier than usual, finding Lucas on the terrace watching the sunrise. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted when she approached. "I kept thinking about everything." "Do you want to talk about it?" Lucas hesitated then nodded. "Before the accident, I had everything planned out. The company, my life. Now I sometimes wonder if I'm going to regain not just my movements, but who I was. Maybe it's not about recovering who you were," Riley suggested gently. "Maybe it's about discovering who you can become." The silence that followed was charged with something indefinable. Lucas watched her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Miss Anderson," Riley, he began, his voice softer than usual. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus, the vice president of Bennett Tech, for an emergency meeting. Riley withdrew discreetly, but not without noticing the long look Lucas threw at him. For the rest of the day, a subtle tension hung between them. Their touches necessary for the exercises seemed charged with electricity. Their conversations, once fluid, were now punctuated by meaningful silences. Riley knew he was entering dangerous territory. Her growing attraction to Lucas wasn't just unethical, it was potentially devastating for both of them. He was a patient, a vulnerable man in recovery, and she was a professional who had sworn to put her patient's well-being first. When evening came, Riley was preparing to leave when he heard Lucas calling his name. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'd like to show you something. If you could come a little earlier?" "Sure," she replied, ignoring the way her heart raced at the request. As she drove home, Riley knew she needed to set clearer boundaries both for Lucas and for herself. But a part of her heart that was growing every day wondered if it wasn't already too late. In her apartment, looking out of the window at the bright city, Riley admitted to herself a truth she had been trying to deny. She was falling in love with Lucas Bennett, and that could cost her not only her job, but also his progress in recovery. The sound of her phone snapped her out of her thoughts, a message from Lucas. "Thanks for today. For everything." Riley closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her conflicting emotions. Tomorrow would be another day, and she would need to find the strength to maintain her professionalism, even if her heart wanted something completely different. The morning began with a soft mist covering Beverly Hills, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere around the Bennett mansion. Riley arrived early as arranged, her heart beating a little faster with anticipation of what Lucas wanted to show her. She met him in the foyer, already in his wheelchair, wearing a navy blue shirt that highlighted his eyes. "Good morning," he said with a smile she was beginning to recognize as genuine. "I hope you don't mind if we start the day differently. As long as it doesn't interfere with your recovery," Riley replied, keeping a professional tone despite the heat she felt on her face. Lucas guided her through a corridor she didn't yet know, arriving at a solid wooden door. He entered a code on the electronic panel, and the door opened, revealing a space that made Riley hold her breath. It was a research and development laboratory full of assistive technology prototypes. On the walls, monitors displayed data and ongoing projects. In the center was a work table with several devices in different stages of development. "This is the heart of Bennett Tech," Lucas explained, moving his chair around the space. "Where everything starts, every idea, every innovation, everything is born here." Riley watched in amazement as he demonstrated some of the project's prostheses, controlled by neural impulses, adaptive mobility systems, communication interfaces for people with different needs. "It's incredible," she murmured, gently touching one of the prototypes. "You've changed the lives of so many people. And now I need the technology one developed," he laughed humorlessly. "The universe has an interesting sense of irony." Riley moved closer, kneeling down to meet his eyes. "It makes you understand the real needs of users better. It's a perspective that few developers have." Their gazes met, and for a moment the air seemed charged with electricity. Lucas reached out hesitantly and lightly touched Riley's face. The contact, though brief, sent shivers down his spine. "Riley, he began, but was interrupted by the sound of his phone. It was Marcus again with yet another corporate emergency. Riley stood up quickly, adjusting her uniform. "We should start our exercise session," she said, her voice slightly shaky. During the morning session, they had both tried to maintain professional normality, but something had changed. Every touch required for the exercises seemed charged with meaning. Each shared glance lasted a second longer than it should have. "Your recovery is progressing faster than expected," Riley commented, consulting his notes during lunch. "The feeling in your legs is returning consistently." "I have good motivation to get better," Lucas replied, his intense gaze fixed on her. In the afternoon, during hydrotherapy, an incident similar to the previous day occurred. Lucas momentarily lost his balance, and Riley held him up. This time, however, he didn't let her pull away immediately. "Why do you pretend you don't feel it too?" he asked softly, their faces dangerously close. "Mr. Bennett," Riley began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm your nurse. There's an ethical line I can't cross." "What if I didn't want you to be just my nurse?" Riley pulled away, his heart hammering in his chest. "Please don't make this harder." The rest of the afternoon passed in tense silence. Riley remained strictly professional, focusing only on the exercises and the medical records. Lucas, for his part, seemed lost in his own thoughts. When evening came, Riley was organizing his things to leave when Lucas appeared in his makeshift office. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I shouldn't have put you in that position. You're the best professional who's ever worked here, and I don't want to risk losing that." "Losing you?" Riley felt her eyes fill with tears. "Thank you for understanding." But as she headed for the door, Lucas called her name once more. "Riley, yes, when I'm recovered. When you're no longer my nurse. Can this conversation be any different?" Riley stopped, his hand on the doorknob, his heart in conflict. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," she replied softly, leaving before her emotions betrayed her. In her apartment that night, Riley couldn't sleep. She relived every moment of the day, in her mind the lab, the soft touch on her face, the tension in the pool, the words laden with promise. He knew he was entering dangerous territory, but for the first time in his career, his professionalism was being challenged by something stronger. His phone vibrated with a message. "The laboratory is not the only place where important things are born." Riley closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her choices. Tomorrow would be another day, and she would need to be stronger. But for now, she allowed herself to feel, just for a moment, the sweet agony of a love that was beginning to blossom in the most inconvenient place and at the most inconvenient time. News of Lucas Bennett's exceptional progress in recovery began to circulate through the corridors of Bennett Tech. In just 3 weeks under Riley's care, he had shown significant improvements that exceeded all medical expectations. However, it was the undocumented changes in the medical records that worried Riley the most. That Friday morning, she found a bouquet of white orchids on her desk in the makeshift office. There was no card, but she knew exactly who they were from. Her heart raced as she fought the smile that threatened to appear on her lips. "They're your favorite flowers, aren't they?" Lucas's voice surprised her. He was standing in the doorway, leaning on crutches, a recent improvement that filled Riley with professional pride and secretly something more. "How do you?" she began, but then remembered mentioning it casually during an exercise session. "I have a good memory," he replied with a half smile, "especially for important details." Riley adjusted his uniform, trying to maintain his professional composure. "Mr. Bennett, about the flowers." "They're just a thank you," he interrupted softly, "for everything you've done for me." Before Riley could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared, announcing the arrival of Dr. Matthews for the monthly evaluation. The moment was broken, and Riley silently thanked her for the interruption. During the assessment, Dr. Matthews didn't hide his amazement at Lucas's progress. "Extraordinary," he murmured as he examined the test results. "Sensitivity has returned much faster than expected, and muscle strength is noticeably better." "I have an excellent nurse," Lucas commented, his gaze meeting Riley's for a moment. After the doctor left, Riley led Lucas out into the garden for his outdoor exercise session, a new addition to the routine she had implemented to vary the recovery environment. Dr. Matthews said, "I'll soon be able to work part-time in the office again," Lucas commented as he performed the balance exercises. Riley felt an inexplicable tightening in her chest. "That's great. It means you won't be needing my services anymore." Lucas stopped the exercises, turning to face her. "Is that what you want, that I don't need you anymore?" The intensity of his gaze made Riley look away. "What I want is irrelevant, Mr. Bennett. My job is to help you recover." "Riley," he took a step towards her, still using the crutches, but more firmly than before. "Look at me." When she finally met his gaze, the vulnerability she saw there completely disarmed her. "You can keep hiding behind professionalism," he continued, "but we both know there's something else going on here." "Please," Riley whispered, taking a step back. "We can't." The moment was interrupted by the sound of heels on the stone path. An elegant woman was approaching Victoria, Hayes, a member of the Bennett Tech Board, as Riley knew from the news. "Lucas, darling," Victoria exclaimed, hugging him all too familiarly. "Why don't you tell me about your progress? I needed to know from Marcus." Riley watched the interaction with a knot in his stomach, noticing how Victoria kept her hand on Lucas' arm, how their smiles were laden with shared history. "I'll put your minds at ease," Riley said professionally. "Mr. Bennett will continue the exercises in an hour." As she walked away, she heard Victoria comment, "So this is the famous nurse who's working miracles. She looks young." In the office, Riley tried to concentrate on the day's notes, but his mind kept returning to the scene in the garden. Victoria's arrival was a cruel reminder of reality. Lucas Bennett belonged to a completely different world from his own. Later during the last session of the day, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "Victoria and I met at college," Lucas said suddenly as Riley adjusted the equipment. "She's been trying for something more for years, but there's never been anything more than friendship. You don't have to explain yourself to me, Mr. Bennett." "But I do," he insisted, holding her wrist gently. "Because your opinion matters to me. You matter to me." Riley felt tears forming in his eyes. "I can't be what you want me to be. Not while I'm your nurse." "And then what then?" She hesitated, her heart beating wildly. "Then it would be complicated for dozens of other reasons." "Like which ones?" "Like the fact that you're Lucas Bennett, CEO of a billion-dollar company, and I'm just a nurse living in a tiny apartment in Silver Lake." Lucas moved closer, his eyes intense. "Is that what you think I care about? Social status, money?" "It's not about what you care about," Riley replied softly. "It's about the real world where people like us don't." "People like us," he interrupted. "People who care about each other, who understand each other, who feel this inexplicable connection." Riley closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words. When she opened them again, her mind was made up. "I'm going to request her transfer her to another professional," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's best for both of us." "Riley, don't. Please, Mr. Bennett. Don't make this harder than it already is." That evening, alone in her apartment, Riley began to draft the transfer request, each word weighing like lead in her heart. It was the right professional decision, she knew that. But as the silent tears streamed down her face, she wondered why doing the right thing hurt so much. Her phone vibrated with a message from Lucas. "Some professional decisions are wrong when they damage the soul. Don't give up on us." Riley put the phone away, her heart at war with her reason. Tomorrow would be another day, and she would need to find the strength to do what was right, even if right meant letting go of the man who was fast becoming the center of her world. The transfer request remained incomplete on Riley's computer screen, the cursor blinking like a silent accusation. It was already Monday, and she had spent the entire weekend trying to convince herself that she was making the right choice. The Bennett mansion looked different that morning, colder, more distant, as if it was already preparing for her departure. "Miss Anderson?" Mrs. Henderson intercepted her in the hallway, her normally stern face marked with concern. "Mr. Bennett didn't sleep all night. He stayed in the laboratory until dawn. He didn't accept breakfast." Riley felt his heart squeeze. "I'm going to check on him right now." He found Lucas in the lab, leaning over the project spread out on the central table. He was using his crutches to support himself, but his posture showed exhaustion. "Working without rest won't speed up your recovery," she said softly, keeping a professional distance. "Nor is abandoning your patient going to make things any easier," he replied without turning around. "I'm not abandoning you. I'm making sure you receive the best possible care without complications." Lucas finally turned to face her, his blue-gray eyes marked by deep dark circles. "Complications, is that what you call what's happening between us? Mr. Bennett, please, call me Lucas again," he ordered, his voice cracking slightly. "Just for a moment, be yourself with me." Riley closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "I can't. If I let my defenses down now, I won't be able to do what needs to be done." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of gardeners working outside. Lucas moved slowly towards her, each step with his crutches echoing in the empty space. Do you know what I discovered working all night? He asked, stopping a few steps away from her. That all the success, all the money, all the technology I've developed, none of it matters if I can't share it with someone who really cares. Someone who sees me beyond the Bennett name, beyond the bank account. Lucas, please, Riley whispered, his resolve beginning to weaken. You saw me at my worst, he continued. You saw my anger, my bitterness, my fear. And yet you stayed. Not out of obligation, not for the paycheck, but because you genuinely cared. It's precisely because I care that I need to leave, Riley replied, his voice shaking. You need a professional focused on your recovery, not someone torn between duty and feelings. Lucas took another step forward, now close enough for Riley to smell his soft perfume. What if I told you that your presence was a fundamental part of my recovery, that every advance I've made has been because you've made me want to be better? The sound of heels in the hallway interrupted the moment. Victoria Hayes appeared in the doorway of the lab, carrying a folder of documents. Oh, sorry, she said, her gaze assessing the proximity between them. I didn't realize you were in a physical therapy session. You're not, Riley replied quickly, turning away. Actually, I was just leaving. Mr. Bennett needs to review some important documents. As he walked towards the door, Riley could feel Lucas's gaze burning into his back. Victoria had already started talking about financial reports and board meetings, pulling him back in her world, a world to which Riley didn't belong. In the hallway, she ran into Marcus, who looked worried. Miss Anderson, can I have a word? In his office, Marcus closed the door and sat down heavily. I understand you're considering applying for a transfer. How? Mrs. Henderson told me. She's worried, and so am I. He paused, choosing his words. Lucas has changed since you arrived. Not just physically. He's more focused, more determined, more human. Mr. Collins, I know it's none of my business, he continued. But as a friend of Lucas's for over a decade, I have to say, I haven't seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not even Victoria, with all her attempts over the years. Riley felt his hands tremble slightly. That's exactly why I need to leave. I can't let personal feelings interfere with your recovery. Marcus smiled sadly. Have you considered that maybe those feelings are exactly what's driving your recovery? Before Riley could answer, her phone vibrated. It was time for her hydrotherapy session. Her last appointment of the day with Lucas, if she went ahead with the transfer. In the pool, the silence between them was deafening. Riley guided the exercises mechanically, trying to ignore the electricity that still coursed through his body every time he had to touch it. If you really leave, Lucas finally said, his voice low but firm, I'll be waiting for the day you're no longer my nurse. Even if it takes months. Riley felt tears forming in her eyes, thankful that the pool water could mask them. Don't make promises you can't keep. I don't, he replied, holding her hand underwater. I only make the ones I intend to keep until the end. That evening, back in his apartment, Riley stared at the transfer request on his computer again. Marcus's words echoed in her mind, mixed with Lucas's promises and her own confused heart. Her phone vibrated with a message. Some decisions change our lives forever. Choose wisely. Riley closed the laptop without sending the request, her thoughts a storm of doubts and possibilities. Tomorrow would be another day, and she still had a crucial decision to make, one that could change not only her professional life, but also her heart forever. Dawn came with an unsent decision in a restless heart. Riley watched Los Angeles wake up from her balcony, the cup of coffee cooling between her hands. His phone vibrated, a message from Mrs. Henderson informing him that Lucas had spent another night at the lab. Arriving at the Bennett mansion, Riley found Marcus in the foyer, his face tense as he spoke on the phone. We can't postpone the board meeting again, he was saying. The shareholders are pressing for answers. When he saw her, Marcus covered the phone. He's been in the lab since yesterday. Even Victoria couldn't get him to leave. Riley nodded, her heart racing as she made her way to the lab. He found Lucas leaning over a project table surrounded by prototypes and technical schematics. You need to rest, she said softly. I need to finish this, he replied without turning around. It's important. Riley approached, noticing the deep circles under his eyes and his unshaven beard. Nothing is more important than your health right now. Lucas finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. This is, he said, indicating the scattered projects. Because it's about you. Riley frowned, confused, until her gaze fell on the technical drawings. They were designs for advanced physiotherapy equipment, specially developed for low-cost rehabilitation clinics. I spent the night researching the rehabilitation center where you work part-time, Lucas explained. I saw the equipment limitations, the difficulties you face. So I started developing solutions. Lucas, Riley felt his throat tighten with emotion. You showed me a world I'd been ignoring, he continued, using his crutches to get closer to her. A world where people fight every day for a chance at recovery without having access to the resources I have. I want to make a difference. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he insisted. Because you made me want to be a better person. Not just to impress you, but because you showed me that I can use my privilege for something bigger than myself. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Victoria, looking annoyed. Lucas, the counsel is waiting. We can't put it off any longer. Lucas sighed, running his hand through his messy hair. Give me 15 minutes to get ready. After Victoria left, Riley helped Lucas get ready for the meeting. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, aware of the closeness between them. I'm going to present these projects to the board today, he said softly, as part of a new division of Bathe Tech focused on accessible assistive technology. They might not approve, Riley warned. The financial return would be lower. Lucas smiled that made her heart skip a beat. Then I'll use my own resources. Some things are more important than profit. During the board meeting, which took place via video conference in the main office, Riley continued with her daily tasks, trying not to think about how empty the mansion would seem without her. The transfer request still weighed heavily on her conscience. Hours later, Lucas found her in the winter garden where she was organizing the physiotherapy equipment. The council has approved it, he announced, his eyes shining with excitement. With a few conditions, but they approved it. And do you know why? Because I showed them the real numbers, how many lives we can impact, how much we can grow in an untapped market. Riley smiled, genuinely happy for him. Congratulations, Lucas. That's going to make a real difference to a lot of people's lives. Riley, he said, his voice turning serious. I found your unsent transfer request in the system. She froze, her heart racing. How? Marcus showed me. He was worried. Lucas approached, using only a crutch, now another sign of his progress. Please don't go. Lucas, we've already talked about this. It's what's best for everyone. What's best for who, he asked. For you are clearly unhappy with the decision. For me, who progresses faster with your care than with any other professional, for the patients who could benefit from the projects we develop together. For your reputation, she replied softly. For Bathe Tech, what would people say about a CEO who got involved with his nurse? I don't care what they would say, Lucas declared. I care about what's real. And what I feel for you is the most real thing I've ever experienced. Riley felt tears forming in her eyes. We can't. Yes, we can, he interrupted. But first I need to recover completely. And I need you as my nurse for that. Then we could just be Lucas and Riley. The silence that followed was filled with all the unspoken possibilities, all the dreams that seemed simultaneously so close and so far away. A week, Riley finally said. Give me a week to think about it. Lucas nodded, respecting her space. I'll wait as long as it takes. But know that every project I develop, every idea I have to help other people, is inspired by you. That evening, alone in her apartment, Riley looked again at the unsent transfer request. Next to it, she opened the photos of the new projects Lucas had shared, equipment that could transform the lives of his patients at the clinic. Her phone vibrated with a message. Some people come into our lives to change not only our story, but the story of many others. You are that person for me. L. Riley closed her eyes, letting the tears finally fall. In a week's time, she would have to make a decision that would change not only her life, but potentially the lives of countless others. The question was, would she be brave enough to follow her heart? The week that Riley asked her to think about turned into a delicate dance between professionalism and feelings that were increasingly difficult to ignore. The Bennett mansion seemed to vibrate with a different energy, as if the atmosphere itself was aware of the growing tension between nurse and patient. During the physiotherapy sessions, Lucas showed surprising progress. Now using only a crutch for support, he was able to walk longer distances around the garden, his determination evident in every step. Riley watched with professional pride, trying to ignore how his heart raced every time he smiled at a new achievement. The doctors are impressed with your recovery. Riley commented during a morning session, adjusting the resistance of the equipment. Dr. Matthew said he's never seen such rapid progress in a similar case. I have excellent motivation, Lucas replied, his eyes meeting hers with that intensity that made her stomach turn. The silence that followed was interrupted by Marcus, who rushed into the makeshift gym. Lucas, we need you on the video conference with the investors in 10 minutes. It's about the new assistive technology division. While Lucas prepared for the meeting, Riley organized his equipment, trying not to think about how every day that passed made his decision more difficult. The transfer request was still on her computer unsent, as a constant reminder of her doubts. Miss Anderson, Mrs. Henderson called quietly. There's someone wanting to speak to you in the lobby. To her surprise, Riley found her younger sister Emma waiting in the hall. What are you doing here? I came to see why my sister has been ignoring my calls for a week, Emma replied, her eyes studying the luxurious surroundings. And now I'm beginning to understand why. Riley led Emma into the garden where they could talk in privacy. Her sister, who knew her better than anyone, immediately realized that something was wrong. You're in love with him, aren't you? Emma asked directly. It's complicated. Riley sighed, taking a seat on one of the garden benches. Love usually is, Emma smiled softly. But you deserve to be happy, Ree. After spending so much time looking after others, maybe it's time to think about yourself. It's not that simple. There are ethical issues, professional issues. And then there's your heart, Emma interrupted. The same heart that made you choose this profession, that made you stay by my side throughout my recovery. Maybe it's time to let you make some decisions. Before Riley could reply, Victoria appeared in the garden, her high heels echoing on the stone paths. Miss Anderson, Lucas is asking for you. Something about demonstrating the new equipment to the investors. In the main office, Lucas was in the middle of a video conference presenting the prototypes developed for rehabilitation clinics. When Riley walked in, her eyes lit up in a way that didn't go unnoticed by the executives on the screen. This is Riley Anderson, Lucas introduced her, the expert who inspired this whole initiative. She can demonstrate better than anyone how this equipment can make a difference in real life. Over the next hour, Riley explained in detail how each piece of equipment could benefit patients with different needs. Her passion for her work was evident, and even the most skeptical investors seemed convinced. After the meeting, Lucas stopped her to leave. You were amazing, he said softly. They've approved the initial investment. We'll be able to start mass production in 3 months. Lucas, that's wonderful. Riley smiled, genuinely happy at the success of the project. It's all thanks to you, he approached, leaning lightly on the table. You changed not just my recovery, but the whole direction of the company. You changed my life. The air between them seemed charged with electricity. Riley could feel his heart beating so hard that he was sure he could hear it. Your sister is still waiting in the garden, she said softly, trying to keep a professional distance. She seems to care a lot about you, Lucas commented. Just like you care about everyone around you. When was the last time anyone cared about you, Riley? The question caught her off guard, making her defenses waver. Lucas, please, the week is almost over, he reminded her gently. And every day that passes makes me more sure of how I feel about you. Riley closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his words. When she opened them again, she found Lucas closer, his familiar scent invading her senses. I have to go, she whispered, even though every fiber of her being wanted to stay. Back in the garden, Emma watched her sister with a knowing smile. Do you know what the best part of my recovery was, she asked. It was having you by my side, motivating me, making me believe that it was possible. Now it's your turn to believe in something for yourself. That evening in her apartment, Riley again stared at the unsent transfer request. Next to it, she opened a folder with photos of Benetech's new projects that could transform the lives of so many people. Her phone vibrated with a message from Lucas. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is allowing yourself to be happy. Good night, Riley. Emma's words echoed in her mind, mixed with Lucas' promises and the possibilities that the future could hold. In 2 days, she would have to give her a definitive answer. But for the first time since this whole situation began, Riley was beginning to consider that perhaps the right path wasn't always the most obvious one. The tension at the Bennett mansion reached its peak when Victoria Hayes called an emergency board meeting. Rumors about the relationship between Lucas and his nurse had begun to circulate in the corporate corridors, threatening the credibility of the new assistive technology project. Riley found Lucas in his office that morning, his posture tense as he read emails on his laptop. The progress in his recovery was evident. He could now walk with just a cane, and his muscle strength had almost completely returned. "The council is concerned," he said as soon as he saw her enter. Victoria presented a report questioning the objectivity of the project, suggesting that it was influenced by personal motivations. "That's exactly what I was afraid of," Riley replied, his heart heavy. "Your work, your reputation." "I don't care about reputation," Lucas interrupted, rising easily from his chair. "But I do care about the truth. And the truth is that this project was born out of a real need identified by a competent professional." Before Riley could reply, Marcus rushed into the office. "Lucas, the investors are requesting a face-to-face presentation. They want to meet the team behind the project." "Great," Lucas replied, surprising both Marcus and Riley. "We'll organize a full presentation with practical demonstrations of the equipment and real patient testimonials." During the preparations for the presentation, Riley remained focused on her professional responsibilities, even though every interaction with Lucas made her heart race. Emma had called earlier, offering support and reminding her that sometimes the hard way was the true way. Victoria showed up in the late afternoon, her face a mask of professional concern. "Miss Anderson, can we talk in private?" In the winter garden, Victoria got straight to the point. "I know your intentions may be the best, but you need to understand the delicate position you're putting Lucas in. Bennett Tech isn't just a company, it's a legacy." "I understand your concern," Riley replied calmly. "But the assistive technology project has nothing to do with any personal relationship. It's about helping real people with real needs." "Please," Victoria laughed humorlessly. "Lucas was never interested in philanthropic projects before you came along. It's obvious that your feelings are clouding your business judgment." Maybe a familiar voice interrupted. "My feelings have just helped me see what I was ignoring before." Lucas was standing at the entrance to the winter garden, his presence commanding immediate attention. Victoria turned around in surprise. "Lucas, darling, we're just trying to protect the company, I know," he added, his voice firm. "But Bennett Tech doesn't need protection. It needs evolution. And Riley showed me a path I'd never considered before." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of footsteps, Mrs. Henderson announcing the arrival of the first investors for the presentation. For the next 2 hours, Lucas and Riley presented the assistive technology project with a synergy that impressed even the most skeptical. Riley demonstrated the equipment, explaining with genuine passion how each innovation could impact real lives. "This isn't just a business project," Lucas concluded, his voice laden with conviction. "It's an opportunity to make a real difference in the world." And yes, it was inspired by an exceptional professional who showed me a perspective I had been ignoring. If that compromises my objectivity in the eyes of some, then maybe it's time to question what really matters in our business. The investors exchanged impressed glances, and even Victoria seemed to reconsider her position. After the meeting, as the executives left animatedly discussing the next steps, Lucas met Riley in the hallway. "Tomorrow's the deadline," he said softly. "You're weak to think." Riley felt his heart race. "Lucas, before you say anything," he interrupted gently, "I want you to know that regardless of your decision, the project will continue. Because you were right, it's bigger than both of us." That evening, alone in her apartment, Riley stared at the illuminated city through her window. The transfer request was still on her computer, awaiting a final decision. Her phone vibrated with a message from Emma. "Sometimes the biggest risk is not risking anything." Her sister's words echoed in her mind as she went over the day's events. Lucas's passion for the project, the way he had defended her, how together they had shown that something meaningful could be born out of even the most unlikely circumstances. Her phone vibrated again, this time with a message from Lucas. "Regardless of tomorrow, you've already changed my life forever. Thank you for that." Riley closed her eyes, letting the tears finally fall. Tomorrow she would have to make a choice between following the safe path of professionalism or risking everything for something her heart already knew to be true. It would be a long night, but for the first time in weeks, she was beginning to see the path ahead of her clearly. The morning that would define Riley's fate arrived with startling clarity. As she drove to the Bennett mansion, her steady hands on the steering wheel contrasted with the swirl of emotions in her chest. The transfer request had been deleted in the early hours of the morning after hours of reflection and a long conversation with Emma. Upon entering the property, Riley encountered an unusual movement. Several executive cars were parked in the driveway, and Mrs. Henderson seemed particularly agitated. "The board has called an extraordinary meeting," the housekeeper explained quickly. "Miss Hayes arrived early with some documents that seem important." Riley felt his stomach tighten. As he walked through the familiar corridors, he could hear excited voices coming from the main office. The door was ajar, allowing fragments of the discussion to reach her. "It's a question of corporate principles," Victoria argued. "We can't risk the whole project because of an inappropriate personal involvement. The only principle at stake here is the integrity of the project." Lucas' voice sounded firm. "The results speak for themselves." Marcus, who was standing near the door, noticed Riley's presence and gestured discreetly for her to enter. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Lucas was standing leaning on his cane, his posture emanating a natural authority that Riley had yet to witness. Victoria held a red folder, her fingers clenching the material with unnecessary force. "Miss Anderson," one of the council members spoke up, "your presence is timely. We are rightly discussing the future of the assisted technology project and my supposedly inappropriate influence over it," Riley added calmly, surprising everyone with his frankness. Lucas took a step towards her, but she subtly raised her hand, asking for space to continue. "Gentlemen, ladies," Riley began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I understand the concerns about the origin of this project and possible conflicts of interest, so allow me to clarify a few points." She walked over to the central table where the prototypes were on display. "Every piece of equipment here was developed based on real needs I've observed over years of practice. Long before I met Mr. Bennett, I was documenting the limitations we faced in rehabilitation clinics." Riley opened his professional folder, pulling out a set of dated notes. "Here are records of adaptations I developed with limited resources, trying to improve patient care." Mr. Bennett not only recognized the potential of these ideas, but had the vision to turn them into affordable solutions. Victoria stepped forward, still holding her red folder. "That doesn't change the fact that there is inadequate personal involvement between you." "The only involvement there is," Lucas interrupted, his voice charged with restrained emotion, "is a shared commitment to something bigger than ourselves." Riley felt his heart skip a beat, but maintained his professional composure. "If you need to question the origin of the project, I suggest you visit the rehabilitation clinics that are already testing the prototypes. Talk to the patients, the professionals. The results are real regardless of any other circumstances." A reflective silence filled the room. Marcus was the first to speak up. "As vice president, I can attest that I've never seen Lucas so dedicated to a project, and the preliminary figures of interest from the market are impressive." The board members exchanged meaningful glances. The chairman of the board, Dr. Harrison, a gray-haired man with a shrewd expression, finally spoke up. "Miss Anderson, what exactly is your vision for the future of this project?" Riley took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "My vision is to see this equipment in every rehabilitation clinic that needs it, to see patients regaining their independence, their dignity." And that she looked directly at Victoria, has nothing to do with personal feelings. "It's about purpose." Dr. Harrison nodded slowly. "What about your position as Mr. Bennett's private nurse?" Riley felt all eyes on her. This was the moment, the decision she had spent the whole night contemplating. "Mr. Bennett is practically recovered," she replied calmly. "My professional role here is coming to an end naturally. What happens after that is a separate issue from the project." Lucas stared at her with an intensity that made her heart race, but she kept her focus on the board. "I propose a vote," Dr. Harrison announced, "on the continuation of the project under its current leadership." The next few minutes were tense, as each member of the board expressed their opinion. In the end, even Victoria had to acknowledge the soundness of the project and its potential benefits. "It is decided then," Dr. Harrison concluded. "The project continues with the recommendation to establish an independent oversight committee." As the meeting drew to a close and the board members began to leave, Riley remained motionless, processing everything that had happened. Lucas approached slowly, his cane making a soft sound on the wooden floor. "You still haven't given me your answer," he said softly when they were alone. Riley turned to face him, years of professional training fighting against what her heart was screaming. "My last session as your nurse will be tomorrow," she replied. "After that, maybe we can find out who we are for each other without all these complications." A slow smile spread across Lucas's face. "Is that a yes to we'll see?" she replied, allowing herself to smile too. One step at a time. When Riley left the office that afternoon, she felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Tomorrow would be her last day as Lucas Bennett's nurse. And then it would be the beginning of a completely new story. Riley's last day as Lucas Bennett's nurse began with a bittersweet feeling. The mansion, which had once seemed an intimidating environment, now carried memories of moments that had changed her life forever. While organizing her equipment for the final session, Riley found little notes she had made about Lucas' progress, each one telling the story of a recovery that had exceeded all expectations. "So it really is his last day," Mrs. Hennison commented, entering the physiotherapy room with a cup of tea. Her normally stern eyes looked softer. "You know, in 15 years of working here, I've never seen this house so alive." Riley smiled, accepting the offered cup. "Things need to change to evolve, don't they?" Speaking of changes, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "The first prototypes are being installed today at the rehab clinic in East Los Angeles. Lucas wants you to accompany the installation, if you're interested." Riley's heart raced at the prospect. "Of course I am." Lucas met them in the lobby, wearing an impeccable suit and using only a decorative cane, more as a precaution than out of real necessity. This smile at the sight of Riley made Mrs. Hennison and Marcus exchange knowing glances before discreetly retreating. "I thought we could do something different today," Lucas suggested. "Your last session as my nurse could be supervising the installation of the equipment we've developed together." "What about your physiotherapy?" Riley asked, maintaining a professional tone, even as her heart leapt. "We can do the exercises there. After all, we need to test the equipment, don't we?" The drive to East Los Angeles was made in comfortable silence in Lucas' Audi. Riley watched the city go by out of the window, remembering how drastically his life had changed in the last few weeks. When they arrived at the clinic, they were greeted by an eager team of physical therapists and technicians. "Miss Anderson," Dr. Rodriguez, the clinic's director, greeted her warmly. "When we heard that you were involved in the development of this equipment, we were sure it would be exactly what we needed." As they supervised the installation, Riley explained each feature to the clinic staff. Lucas watched her with barely concealed admiration, noticing how she lit up as she demonstrated how the equipment could benefit different types of patients. "You were born for this," he commented softly when they were momentarily alone, "to make a difference to people's lives." "We were born for this," she corrected. "You just needed a little push in the right direction." The morning passed quickly between demonstrations and training sessions. During lunch served in the clinic's small cafeteria, Lucas surprised Riley with a proposal. "I want you to head up the development division," he said. "No one understands the real needs of patients and professionals better. You'd be the bridge between the corporate world and the practical world." Riley almost choked on his sandwich. "Lucas, I have no corporate experience, but you have something much more valuable: passion for what you do and practical knowledge. The rest can be learned." Before Riley could reply, they were interrupted by a small commotion. A little girl in a wheelchair had just arrived for her physiotherapy session and was amazed by the new equipment. "Can I try?" she asked, her eyes shining with hope. Riley exchanged a glance with the physiotherapist in charge, and after his approval, helped the little girl into position on the adapted muscle-strengthening equipment. "See, it's like a game," Riley explained, showing her how the interactive monitor responded to her movements. "Each exercise gives you points." Lucas watched the scene with a full heart, seeing how something that began as a project inspired by personal feelings was really transforming lives. In the late afternoon, while the final adjustments were being made to the equipment, Riley found a moment to reflect. This was officially her last day as Lucas Bennett's nurse. Tomorrow, a new phase would begin, a phase full of possibilities and uncertainties. $1 for your thoughts," Lucas joked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee from the reception machine. "I was thinking about how life turns around," she replied, accepting the coffee. "A few weeks ago, I was nervous about my first day as your nurse. And now I'm nervous about all the days that come after. Lucas placed his cup on a nearby table and gently held Riley's hands. We don't need to have all the answers now. We can find out together one day at a time. The moment was interrupted by Dr. Rodriguez, who came to personally thank them for donating the equipment. As he chatted animatedly about the benefits it would bring to the community, Riley realized that she had made up her mind about Lucas' proposal. "I accept," she said when they were finally alone again. "What, the position in the development division? But on one condition." Lucas raised an eyebrow, curious. "And what would that be?" "I want to continue seeing some patients here at the clinic, so that I never lose the connection with the real reason why we do this." The smile that lit up Lucas' face was answer enough. When they left the clinic, at the end of the day, something had definitely changed between them. They were no longer nurse and patient, but two people who had found a greater purpose through their connection. So Lucas said as he drove back, "Since I'm officially no longer your patient." Riley smiled, his heart light for the first time in weeks. "One step at a time, Mr. Bennett. One step at a time." A week had passed since Riley had officially left her position as Lucas Bennett's private nurse, and the transition to her new position in Bennett Tech's development division was proving to be as challenging as it was exciting. The room she now occupied on the 20th floor of the corporate building in downtown Los Angeles offered a spectacular view of the city, but it was in the development labs, 3 floors below, where she really felt at home. "The tests of the new neural feedback system are impressive," Marcus commented, entering his office with a stack of reports. "The partner clinics are reporting a 40% improvement in patient response." Riley smiled, pleased with the results. Her insistence on maintaining direct contact with the rehabilitation clinics was proving to be a wise decision. Every Thursday, she still saw patients in East Los Angeles, keeping alive the connection with the field work she loved so much. "Miss Anderson," her new assistant Jenny interrupted through the intercom. "Mr. Bennett is requesting your presence in the main conference room." Riley's heart raced slightly, as it always did when she heard Lucas's name. Since she had stopped being his nurse, they had kept a respectful professional distance, although the tension between them was palpable to anyone paying attention. In the meeting room, Lucas was presenting the new projects to a group of international investors. When Riley entered, their eyes met briefly, and that familiar electric current ran down his spine. "And here is the person who revolutionized our approach to assistive technology." Lucas introduced her, his professional tone masking the affection in his gaze. "Riley Anderson, our development director." During the presentation, Riley explained the technical aspects of the new equipment with the same passion she showed when she was a nurse. The investors seemed particularly impressed by her practical approach and in-depth knowledge of patients' real needs. "Extraordinary," commented one of the investors after the meeting. "Bennett Tech has found a real diamond in you, Miss Anderson." When the room emptied, Lucas closed the door, leaving them alone for the first time in days. "You were amazing," he said softly. "As always." "Lucas," Riley began, feeling her heart racing. "Dinner with me tonight?" he asked abruptly. "No corporate titles, no meetings, just us." Riley hesitated for a moment. They had agreed to go slowly, to allow time for the professional transition to settle in completely. But after a week of stolen glances and formal conversations, the tension was becoming unbearable. "All right," she finally replied, "but nothing too formal." Lucas' smile lit up his face. "I'll pick you up at 8. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and project reviews, but Riley could barely concentrate. At 7:30, he was in his apartment in Silver Lake, trying to decide what to wear when his phone rang. It was Emma. "How's the new corporate life going?" her sister asked, amusement evident in her voice. "Different," Riley replied, holding the phone between her shoulder and ear as she tried on another dress. "But in a good way. I feel like I'm really making a difference on a bigger scale." "What about the handsome CEO?" Riley blushed, grateful that her sister couldn't see her expression. "We're having dinner tonight." Emma's excited shout nearly deafened her. "Finally, please tell me you're going to wear that blue dress you bought last month." At 8 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. When Riley opened the door, Lucas was standing there without his usual business suit, wearing jeans and a casual shirt, and still looking incredibly elegant. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his eyes roaming over the blue dress she had chosen. Lucas took her to Venice Beach, where a table awaited them in a small restaurant by the sea. The place was unpretentious, but charming with soft lights and the sound of the waves as background music. No formalities today, he explained as he pulled out a chair for her. Just Lucas and Riley. The conversation flowed naturally as it always had between them. They talked about work, but also about their lives, their dreams, their hopes. Riley talked about growing up in Portland, about how Emma's illness had shaped her career choice. Lucas talked about his parents, about how the accident that took them away from him had directed his focus towards life-saving technologies. "You know what I miss most?" Lucas asked as they walked along the beach after dinner. "Our conversations during the physiotherapy sessions. You always knew exactly what to say to make me keep trying." Riley smiled, remembering those moments. "You were a stubborn patient, and you were a persistent nurse," he replied, stopping to stare at her. The moonlight reflected off the ocean, creating an almost magical atmosphere. "You're still the most persistent person I know." "Lucas," Riley began, but he gently placed a finger over her lips. "Let me finish," he asked softly. "You changed my life, Riley. Not just by helping me recover physically, but by showing me a greater purpose. And now, every day I work with you, I see even more clearly how extraordinary you are." Riley's heart was beating so loudly that she was sure he could hear it. Lucas stepped forward, eliminating the distance between them. "I still think we should go slowly," she whispered, even as her body leaned towards him. "We can go as fast as you want," he replied, his hand gently touching her cheek. "But I can't pretend anymore that I don't feel what I feel for you." When their lips finally met, it was as if the whole universe made sense. The kiss was soft, gentle, full of promise and possibility. When they parted, they were both smiling. "I think slow just got a new definition," Riley joked, his heart light. Lucas laughed, intertwining his fingers with hers as they resumed their walk along the beach. The future was still uncertain, with challenges and adjustments to be made, but at that moment, under the starry Los Angeles sky, everything seemed perfectly possible. The news of Lucas Bennett and Riley Anderson's relationship spread quickly through the corridors of Bennett Tech. A few weeks had passed since that night in Venice Beach, and both were learning to navigate the delicate balance between professional and personal life. "The third quarter numbers are impressive," Victoria commented during a board meeting, her eyes studying Riley with a mixture of reluctant respect and caution. The assistive technology division exceeded all initial projections. Riley maintained his professional demeanor as he presented the latest developments. The project now served dozens of clinics across California, with plans to expand to other states. Lucas, sitting at the head of the table, occasionally met her gaze, a small smile on his lips that made her heart race. After the meeting, Marcus met her in the hallway. "Do you have a minute? There's something I need to show you." In the development lab, a team of engineers was working on a new prototype of virtual rehabilitation system that promised to revolutionize the treatment of patients with severe limitations. It was inspired by his notes on patient motivation, Marcus explained. Lucas insisted that it be a priority. Riley watched in amazement as the technicians demonstrated the equipment. It was exactly the kind of innovation she had always dreamed of seeing implemented, but never imagined possible. "Miss Anderson," Jenny interrupted through the phone. "Dr. Rodriguez from the clinic in East LA is on the line. It sounds urgent." The news was unexpected. One of the clinic's main donors was threatening to withdraw her support after finding out about Riley and Lucas' relationship. The donor argued that the development of the equipment had been influenced by personal, not professional interests. "This is ridiculous," Lucas said when Riley informed him in his office. "The results speak for themselves." "But perception matters," Riley replied softly, "especially when it comes to charities." Lucas stood up from his chair, walking over to the window that offered a panoramic view of Los Angeles. "I'm not going to let our relationship jeopardize something so important." "Maybe," Riley hesitated, his heart heavy. "Maybe we should be more discreet for a while." "No," Lucas turned to face her, his voice firm. "I'm not going to hide like we're doing something wrong. There's another solution." The next morning, Lucas called a press conference. Riley watched nervously from backstage as he addressed the journalists. "Bennett Tech has always prided itself on its transparency," he began. "Today, I want to address the rumors about the development of our assistive technology division." Calmly and clearly, Lucas presented all the project documentation, from Riley's original notes in his old clinics to the current results of the equipment in use. He showed how each development had been reviewed by independent committees and tested in multiple institutions. Yes, Riley Anderson and I are in a relationship, he declared openly. But that relationship began after the project was already underway. The real story here isn't about us, it's about the lives that are being transformed by this technology. He then invited patients and professionals from various clinics to share their experiences. The stories were powerful and moving, demonstrating the real impact of the project. When the press conference was over, Riley found Lucas in his office. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, taking her hands. "Because I don't want you to ever doubt your professional value or feel like you have to choose between our relationship and your job." That afternoon, during her weekly visit to the clinic in East LA, Riley was surprised by Emma, who appeared with a knowing smile. "I saw the press conference," her sister commented as she watched Riley work with the patient. "He really loves you, you know." That Riley blushed, adjusting the parameters of the equipment. "It's complicated." "No, it's not," Emma laughed. "You just like to make things more difficult than they need to be." At the end of the day, Lucas surprised Riley by showing up at the clinic. He watched in silence as she finished a session with a young patient, her face soft with admiration. "Do you know what I love most about you?" he asked when they were finally alone. "How you've never lost your essence, even with all the changes in your life." Riley smiled, allowing herself to relax in his arms. "And you've never let power change who you really are." "So," Lucas smiled, "dinner at my place tonight. Mrs. Henderson is making that risotto you love." "Only if you promise not to talk about work," Riley teased. "Deal," he laughed, kissing her softly. As they left the clinic together, Riley reflected on how life could change in unexpected ways. A few months ago, she was just a dedicated nurse, trying to make a difference one patient at a time. Now she was helping to transform lives on a scale she never imagined possible, alongside someone who shared her passion for making the world a better place. The sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange as they drove back to the Bennett mansion, a place that for Riley had been transformed from an intimidating environment into a second home. The complications and challenges were still there, but now she knew they were worth it, because some love stories are bigger than the circumstances that surround them. 6 months have passed since the press conference that changed everything. Bennett Tech's assistive technology division had expanded beyond California, reaching clinics all over the country. Riley watched out of his office window as a soft fall rain fell over Los Angeles, reflecting on how his life had completely transformed. The results of the clinical trial in Chicago are in, Marcus announced, entering his office with a broad smile. 100% approval from professionals and patients. Riley smiled, picking up the report. The new virtual rehabilitation system had exceeded all expectations, especially with children. The success stories that came in daily still thrilled her as much as on the first day. "Miss Anderson," Jenny interrupted through the phone. "Dr. Rodriguez is here for the meeting about the clinic expansion." The clinic expansion project in East LA was special to Riley. With the success of the pilot program, Bennett Tech had decided to turn it into a center of excellence in rehabilitation, offering free treatment to low-income patients. Riley, Lucas appeared in the doorway before she left for the meeting, his smile making her heart race even after all these months. "I need you to clear your schedule for tonight." "Lucas, I have reports to review, and trust me," he interrupted softly, his eyes shining with a secret she couldn't decipher. The meeting with Dr. Rodriguez was productive, but Riley found it difficult to concentrate fully. There was something different in the air, an expectation she couldn't explain. Emma had called 3 times during the morning, each time sounding more excited and mysterious than the last. As the sun began to set, Jenny entered her office with an elegant box. "It's arrived for you, Miss Anderson." Inside the box, Riley found a stunning emerald green dress and a simple note, "Dress to celebrate. Driver waiting in lobby, L." The driver took her across town to a familiar destination, the clinic in East LA, where it all really began. Riley frowned, confused, as the car pulled up in front of the apparently closed building. "Right this way, Miss Anderson." Mrs. Henderson emerged from the entrance, smiling in a way Riley had never seen before. The interior of the clinic had been transformed. Soft lights illuminated the path through the corridors, and white flowers decorated every surface. When she reached the physiotherapy area, Riley stopped, thrilled. The space was completely different. Where once there had been medical equipment, now there was an elegant but intimate decor. In the center of the room, Lucas was waiting for her, impeccable in a dark suit, leaning lightly on his cane, which he now used more out of style than necessity. "Welcome to the place where our story really began," he said softly as she approached. "Lucas, what's all this? This clinic," he began, taking her hands, "is where you showed me that there was a greater purpose to everything. It was here that I realized I wasn't just recovering physically, but discovering who I really wanted to be." Riley felt tears forming in her eyes as Lucas continued. "Every piece of equipment here represents a part of our journey. Every life transformed by this project is a testament to what we can accomplish together." He paused, dropping one of his hands to reach into his pocket. "And this is where I want to start our next chapter." Riley's heart stopped as Lucas knelt down without any difficulty, final proof of his complete recovery. "Riley Anderson," he said, his voice tinged with emotion, "you taught me that caring for someone goes beyond a professional. You showed me that sometimes we need to fall to find out who we really are. And now I want to spend the rest of my life repaying all the love, dedication, and inspiration you bring to my life." Opening a small velvet box, he revealed a delicate ring with an emerald the same color as the dress she was wearing. "Would you do me the honor of marrying me?" Riley could barely see through the tears that were now running freely down her face. "Yes," she whispered 1,000 times yes. When Lucas slid the ring onto her finger, applause and cheers erupted around them. Emma, Marcus, Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Rodriguez, and the entire clinic staff emerged from their hiding places, all part of the elaborately planned surprise. "You knew about this all along," Riley accused her sister through laughter and tears. "And it was torturous keeping it a secret," Emma replied, hugging her tightly. The evening turned into a celebration, not only of their engagement, but of everything they had achieved together. Between the congratulations and hugs, Lucas and Riley found a moment of privacy. "Do you know what I love most about you?" he asked, holding her close. "How you've never lost your essence amidst all the changes. You're still the same Riley who walked into that mansion months ago, determined to make a difference. And you're still the same stubborn Lucas who refused to do the exercises," she teased, making him laugh. "But now I'm a stubborn Lucas, completely in love and ready for a new adventure." As the celebration continued around them, Riley looked at the ring on her finger, then at the equipment they had developed together, and finally at the man who had captured her heart in ways she had never imagined possible. Their story had begun as a professional relationship, turned into something deeper, and was now about to enter a new chapter. But one thing remained constant: their sheer desire to make a difference in the world, one patient at a time. "Forever us," Lucas whispered in her ear. "Forever us." Riley confirmed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Outside, the Los Angeles night shone with thousands of lights like earthly stars, celebrating the love that had been born out of adversity and blossomed into something extraordinary. A love that had not only transformed 2 lives, but would continue to transform many others through the legacy they had built together.